Since retiring from politics in 2006, former Prime Minister Paul Martin has dedicated much of his time to raising awareness about the educational challenges faced by young Aboriginal Canadians. So it should come as no surprise that he's not very happy about the Harper government's decision to withdraw Bill C-33, also known as the First Nations Control of First Nations Education Act, along with the funding that goes with it. Now, joining us for more in Montreal, Quebec, Paul Martin, 21st Prime Minister of Canada and the founder of the Martin Aboriginal Education Initiative. And Mr. Martin, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to TVO. How are we doing today?
We're doing well. How are you doing?
Just great. Thanks very much. I want to start, before we talk about today, just putting our discussion in a bit of context, because I want to go back about a decade to the time when your government and the Assembly of First Nations successfully negotiated the Kelowna Accord, which would have flowed, I think, $5 billion to Aboriginal communities and was considered at the time quite a significant achievement. What enabled you to get that agreement in place?
Well, I think that probably the most important thing was trust. I had great confidence and trusted Phil Fontaine and the other Aboriginal leaders who were there, and I believe that he trusted me as well as Andy Scott, who was our minister, and in fact trusted us in what we wanted to do. I think the next thing that happened is that we didn't go in there and impose anything on them. We didn't tell them these are the issues you're going to deal with. We sat down with all of the Aboriginal leadership, along with the provincial premiers and the territorial leaders, members of my cabinet, and said, what do you think the issues are? And the issues they named were the issues that we thought were the important ones. We then said, what do you think the solutions are? Well, let's talk from that basis. There'll be a negotiation. But I think the other thing was we gave it plenty of time. The fact of the matter is we started this virtually the day that I became Prime Minister, and it took 15 to 18 months of negotiation. But what that meant was that when we would put a proposal down and when we were getting close, this gave them the chance to go back and talk to their communities and basically bring them within so that there were no surprises. There was no attempt to put something over on anybody, to impose somebody on a very short time scale, which we knew, in fact, if we had done, they would never have been able to do. And that's one of the big mistakes this government has made. They didn't ask what the issues were. They didn't try to arrive at a solution, and they refused to give the AF any time to go back and consult with their membership, which in fact was absolutely crucial.
Well, you've anticipated where I wanted to go next, which was, in fact, fast forward a decade to the current process that broke down and, in fact, cost the Assembly of First Nations Grand Chief Sean Atleo his job since he resigned when the thing fell apart. Beyond what you've just said, why do you think it fell apart so badly this time?
Well, it goes back to the issue of trust. The fact is that when the current government axed Kelowna, what they did is they walked away from the necessity in terms of education of providing fair funding. In other words, right now, if you go to a reserve school, you receive anywhere from 20 to, in some cases, 50% per capita less funding than the provinces are providing for a school that might be, 2 kilometers away. Everybody understood that gap existed. And then the first time that the AFN got ready to meet with the Prime Minister, the day before, the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time made a public announcement that there was no such gap, which meant that the whole purpose of the meeting had been thrown into the wastebasket, and everybody knew there was a gap. And of course, the proof of that was 6 months later, the government admitted that there was a huge funding gap. That's when they put the $1.9 billion on the table. But having admitted there was a gap, having canned Kelowna, the government then said, but we're not going to give you any money for another 2 to 3 years. That meant that a young person who, at the day of Kelowna, went into grade 1, would have spent their entire primary school years, 8 years, without having any kind of a semblance of fair funding with other Canadians. That means that their ability to learn to read and write was held back. They were forced into a position of catch-up. And the Aboriginal leadership knew that. If I could just say one other thing, and this is really very important. The government accuses the First Nations of trying to block progress. That's not what they're trying to do. What the First Nations are saying is, we love our children. And we want to provide our children with the same education that you provide your children. We want to provide our children with the same opportunities. And for the Canadian government to do what they have now done, but to come along and say, it is my way or the highway, it's our plan or no plan, and we're not going to listen to you, I don't think there's a parent in this country would stand for that.
I appreciate that answer, but I wonder if our viewers might be a little confused because of the two following things that they may have heard about this. Number one, here's a speech, an excerpt of a speech that you gave on May 31st to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, in which you said the federal government underfunds their education and underfunds their health care, and that is morally wrong. It's also economically dumb. Having said that, the Fraser Institute then publishes a report in which it suggests Aboriginal education funding has outpaced is their word, the rest of the population significantly. Who are we to believe?
Anybody who understands the numbers knows full well. All you have to do is to go on to a First Nation school. You know, schools built on toxic dumps, teachers whose salaries are substantially below teachers in the rest of the country, schools that can't keep their principals, can't keep their teachers. The fact is that with 20% of Aboriginal students have one form of disability or another, whether it be hearing, whether it be eyesight, or just simply some of the learning issues. You go into a public school and there are programs dealing with kids who have disabilities. That does not exist on reserve anywhere near to the extent that it should. Anybody who has been on a First Nation school knows that there is gross underfunding.
The last time you were on this program, we talked about your Aboriginal Education Initiative, and I think we need to know a little more, though, about another program that you're involved with called the Capital for Aboriginal Prosperity and Entrepreneurship Fund. You started that with $50 million in 2009. Can you give us some understanding of how those two projects complement each other towards the larger vision that you have?
Well, let's just go back. In terms of the economy and in terms of somebody's ability to provide for themselves, obviously, education is absolutely crucial. And so what our education initiative does is that's what it does. It basically works in terms of elementary school and secondary school education. One of the courses that we provide, which has been a huge, huge success, is what we call the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program, which is a grade 11 and grade 12 business course, marketing, accounting, all of the various things that you would need to be an entrepreneur to start a business. We started 4 years ago with one school. We're now, and next fall, we'll be in 44 Aboriginal schools across the country. And it's the first time in the history of this country, and in fact most countries, where there has been a set of Aboriginal textbooks written by Aboriginals for Aboriginals. All of it saying if you're a young Indigenous person, this is what you can do and these are the role models you can follow. But the problem is, of course, if you're a young Aboriginal entrepreneur, it's a lot harder for you to raise money from banks. It's a lot harder for you to get somebody to mentor you. It's a lot harder for you to give you the tools that you're going to need, even if you've taken this kind of a course, even if you've taken a business school course. And so we raised this money from 21 of the major Canadian companies in this country in order to be able to invest in the entrepreneurship capacity of young Aboriginal Canadians.
I'm just curious as to why, I mean, you've been on this program numerous times and, of course, giving speeches across the country and have long, particularly from your time in public life as well, established your bona fides on this. However, you are in some respects trying to overcome hundreds and hundreds of years of history of mistrust between Aboriginal Canadians and the so-called white man. Why are they not a little bit suspicious of what you're up to here?
Who is they?
Aboriginal Canadians, as you try to do these good works.
Well, the fact is that I've gotten to know them, and it may be that some of them are. I mean, I can't guarantee you, but I can tell you that certainly right across the country, the Aboriginal Canadians that I've been able to work with, and I got to know, and I think I know quite a lot, we work very, very closely together. It goes back to this issue of trust. It goes back to being fair, and it also has an enormous amount to do with respect. You know, when you sit down and you start talking about, for instance, the Aboriginal worldview, the way in which they look at things, their deep ties to the land, which is something, if you look at the mess that we've made environmentally, a lot of us wish we had understood a lot many years earlier. I think that you build up that sense of confidence, and you've also got to understand that these are our proud people, and they have succeeded immensely. And despite the fact, residential schools and all of that we have done, they have not given up on the desire to preserve their languages and their culture, and that's a very important part of who they are. And we're going to build a strong country. We'd better understand where they're coming from.
Since we're talking on an Ontario broadcaster right now, I should perhaps ask a follow-up on how successfully you've managed to penetrate this province with the Educational Initiative and with the Entrepreneur Program. How into Ontario are you?
Well, the first school that we started on was on a reserve school in Thunder Bay, serving people who were living in 300 people communities down the shores of Hudson's and James Bay, and that's the course where we first started. Not long ago, we announced, along with the Government of Ontario, that we were opening next fall in 10 new schools, Aboriginal schools within the public school system. So we've really expanded right across the country. We're now virtually in every region of the country.
And those 10 schools in Ontario, any of them south of the French River?
They're all over the province. They're schools that have been picked specifically to be all over the province, and they're schools that essentially are going to deal with the entrepreneurship program. But we're also in 2 primary schools on reserve in southwestern Ontario, Kettle and Stony Point and Walpole Island. And what this is essentially a course based on an Ontario program that was put in place about 20 years ago, a turnaround program focusing on literacy. And the school has now just completed its 5 years, both schools, and they've been a tremendous success. The results are really marked.
Can you follow up? Well, actually, let me just read a little excerpt of something, and then I'll get you to follow up on that, because from the publication, Providing a Guiding Hand, it says the success gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians has deep roots, most of which begin in early childhood. Because of this, improving the quality of education provided by elementary schools on reserve must be a priority. You've now just told us about your 5-year-long model school pilot project. The Chippewas, the Stony Point First Nation, presumably some data is in. What's it telling us about how much success you've had?
Well, the final evaluation will really be available at the end of this month. It's being done by essentially the dean at OISE, at the Faculty of Education, University of Toronto. I would expect, if it's the same as in the previous years, it's going to show that we made very, very strong progress. And it's because essentially what the program does, it invests in the principals and it invests in the teachers in those schools. And what it really demonstrates is that if you give teachers and principals and you give the band councils and the educators a real chance with those young kids, you cannot help but succeed. And that is the message that's got to get across. That is the message that's got to get across. Give a young Aboriginal student the same opportunities as a student has elsewhere, and they will succeed.
Let me ask you a bit of a, what I might call an in-your-face question, Mr. Martin. We've known each other long enough. I hope you won't mind. When you were the finance minister back in the middle 90s and, laboring like hell to bring down that deficit that almost had us on credit watch around the world, if memory serves, you did put, I think, a cap maybe of 2% on on funding for Aboriginal programs in order to help balance that budget. And, we're almost 20 years after that now, and I wonder, with the fullness of time, whether you think that spending cap was harmful to the long-term interests of Aboriginal Canadians.
Well, essentially what you may remember at that time, we cut spending right across the board. There was no place that was basically exempt from those cuts, except Aboriginal spending because of the increasing size of their population. And so what we did there was we put a cap on it. That cap effectively didn't hold back First Nations education on reserve at that time. But what happened was later on, that cap then did begin to bite, and that was one of the main reasons behind Kelowna, because what Kelowna did was to effectively come in and eliminate the gap. And so, in other words, we solved the issue that you've just raised, and you've raised quite properly. The problem is that Ralph Goodale booked $5 billion, $1.8 billion of which was for education at that point, and it was to continue to climb. And when the new Harper government came in, they expropriated the money. They scooped the money, and obviously at that point the cap really began to hurt.
Ralph Goodale, you're referencing, of course, your finance minister of the day. Let's try this. Now that, in our last few minutes, I'd really like to get your best advice for the Harper government. I know they probably don't call you up asking for advice, but I want to get it anyway. Now that C-33 has been rejected, Sean Atleo is out as the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. They have to try to pick up the pieces, presumably, and try to recraft something to get this issue back on the table and try to establish some of that trust you talked about in your first answer. What can they do?
Well, the first thing, they've got to basically put this rhetoric of my way or the highway, our plan or no plan. They've got to basically put that in the garbage can because it isn't going to work. And they've got to do really two things. The first, I think, is that they should go back to the First Nations and they should say to them, okay, you come to us. We'll work with you. You come to us with what you think is required. They've got outstanding educators, the First Nations do. And let those educators of the First Nations put together the kind of plan that is required. And then the government should sit down and say, now let's see if we can make this work. Go back to the parents of those students. Let the parents go to their own experts. And I can tell you that they have got educational experts who can stand up to anybody in this country and say, tell us what you believe you need so that your children can have a proper education. Let's just give you one example. You know, and I've heard this, from the government. What do they want to teach the languages for? What do they want to teach them the culture for? The fact is that the studies are overwhelming. That a student who feels comfortable in their culture, in their identity, is going to learn faster. There's no public service in anywhere in this country apart from Aboriginals themselves who can talk to you about their culture and their education. Let them talk to you about their worldview so that when these children are learning history, when these children are learning about the environment, or they're learning science, let them learn their own way of looking at it as well as the Western way. Let's give them the opportunity to have their education system work. I know there's no doubt in my mind that if the government is prepared to listen before acting, that they can bridge this gap.
Do you think the relationship is too far gone and too negative between the two sides as to be irreparable? Well, it certainly seems from the government's point of view pretty bad. They are certainly the public statements that have come out from the government have been certainly not the kind that would encourage anybody who wanted to make something work. But I do know, having talked to the First Nations leadership on this, and the other Aboriginals, the Métis and the Inuit, right across the country, that goes back to the opening thing that I said, these are their children. They want their children to succeed. And I think that they will do anything to make that happen. That's the reason that the First Nations today are not at the table. Is that the government essentially gave them a plan that wouldn't work. And a plan, by the way, that was going to be totally controlled by the government. I mean, what the government did was to create a 9-person commission. The Minister of Aboriginal Affairs was going to name the chairman, not the First Nations. The Minister of Aboriginal Affairs was going to accept recommendations, but not necessarily implement the recommendations for 4 of the people, but guaranteed that commission was going to be majority non-Aboriginal. Doesn't make any sense. So if the government is genuine, then there's no doubt that this can be made to work. Mr. Martin, we're always grateful for your time here on TVO. Thanks for checking in with us, and one hopes we'll do this again down the road.
Anytime you want.
Thanks so much. Paul Martin from the Martin Aboriginal Education Initiative, Canada's 21st Prime Minister.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.